Around a year or two ago, I decided I needed to delve deeper into music made by people from Ireland. I've always believed so much in supporting local and the importance of knowing as much about the country you're from as possible. I began my journey into Irish music by shooting photos for local bands, doing gigs around the city, getting a real feeling for where Irish rock and roll and indie music was in the modern day. When talking to these bands, I always asked them about the bands that inspired them and if any of them were Irish, and a few came up, mainly the likes of the Cranberries, Rory Gallagher, and Stuffed Little Fingers. But the band that came up the most was a band I had definitely heard of, but never really delved into. But once I did, I was hooked. Lizzy, an absolute powerhouse in the Irish music scene and rock and roll in general during the 70s and early 80s. Led by Lynott, the band was the first Irish rock band to be successful worldwide, garnering fans all over Europe, America, Australia, and Asia. With catchy hooks, an overdriven fuzzy guitar tone, and top-notch vocals, the band was an unstoppable force during this era. Once I started listening to the band, I couldn't help but want to learn more about them. When researching them, their lead singer Lynott really stood out to me as he was such a unique character. Lynott was also an unbelievable talent. His vocals and lyrics spoke for an entire nation and generation, telling stories of youth and hardships which Phil knew all too well. He went through a lot of hardships himself in life before and after Thin Lizzy, mainly with his racial identity growing up in Ireland and issues with substances. After learning a good amount about Phil, I knew I had to make this documentary. I've never wanted to learn so much about one person in my entire life, never mind make a documentary to show the world and all my friends the amazing life he led and the inspiration he's left for an entire generation. So I made a plan. I decided I was going to contact everybody I could, from people who knew Phil to people who knew a lot about Phil, to try and make the best documentary I possibly can, and first on my list was Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim is an Irish artist from Donner in County Meath, but then moved to Dublin. He is most famous for his infamous painting of Che Guevara and his album artwork done for most of Thin Lizzy's albums. As well as doing their album covers, he was also a very close friend with Phil, and thankfully he agreed to do an interview with me. As well as Jim, I wanted to get in contact with the Irish Rock and Roll Museum in Dublin. They have an entire room dedicated to Thin Lizzy, filled with authentic instruments used by the band, as well as tons of other memorabilia and tour guides with a wealth of knowledge on the band and Phil. It's also a great excuse just to go down to Dublin and see a lot of the areas that Phil grew up in, started writing music in, and a lot of the bars he drank in too. So I started emailing, and the Irish Rock and Roll Museum replied telling me I could have a private tour of the Thin Lizzy exhibit in Dublin. But before I went to Dublin, it was time to call Jim, so then I could gather better information of whereabouts Dublin I should be looking to get a great understanding of where Phil grew up. How did you meet Phil, and what were your first impressions of him?
That's a really, what's the word for an interesting question, because Philip and myself used to promenade, for want of a better word, on Grafton Street at lunch hours, right? I used to hang out with people like Eamon Carr from Horselips and Peter Fallon and quite a few musicians of the period. Now, they weren't musicians at the time. We were all working in advertising, right? On one side of the road of Grafton Street, Philip would walk up on the right-hand side and I'd walk down on the left-hand side. And we'd always nod at each other, even though we didn't know each other. He was the only black man bloody in Dublin, virtually, aside from Dave Murphy, another mate of mine. And then one day I was working in advertising, freelance work. We were photographing someone, and Roy Esmond, the photographer, asked me, could I come in early? He wanted to do a portrait of me. And it was a five-story Georgian house, so you have to go up the steps, a bit run down. The studio's up at the top on Gardner Street, opposite the Hugh Lane Gallery. And as I was going up the stairs, Philip was coming down. So now remember, we'd never met properly, but we suddenly went, oh yeah, how's it going? Grand, bye. You know what I mean? That was it. But that was the only contact I really had with him before I got a phone call from Frank Murray, who wanted me to meet Philip. I met them in Neary's pub, and Philip said, I want you to do our graphics. I want to do something different. And you're the only one besides Tim who can do anything different in this country. You know, now there were other people who could, but that's beside the point.
While talking to Jim, he told me so many amazing stories. Sadly, too many stories for me to be able to fit them all into this documentary. There are two, however, I want to come back to later. But for now, I think it's time for me to show you my trip to Dublin. I headed on down, and my first stop was Crumlin, where it all began. Although Phil was born in England, his mother Philomena decided to send him to Ireland to live with his grandparents here at Leyland Road in Crumlin. At the time, Crumlin was quite an underprivileged area on the south outskirts of Dublin, but only being a half hour away from the city centre and the epicentre of Irish rock and roll, he was in the right place. You see a lot of interviews with Phil when he would have been on the TV doing press, whether it was for Thin Lizzy or any solo stuff, and identity was always such a, for some reason, it's all anyone wanted to ask him about. It was like, oh,
Yeah,
so are you black or are you Irish? Are you British? And like, people couldn't perceive the idea of a black Irishman, and it definitely like,
they kept questioning his identity. I mean, towards the very end of his life, he was asked by this beautiful girl on some program, wasn't it? And she said something about a British band, and he said, no, Irish. And she kept on British, and he kept saying Irish, like I'm from Dublin.
Oh, you sound like a British person. No, no, I'm just teasing.
Irish. I'm Irish. You gotta get that right.
Well, Great Britain, British.
No,
no, an
Irish,
accent.
Republic
Well,
of Ireland.
my goodness.
There you go. That's very important.
although Phil obviously got great attention for it, I'm also sure he got great abuse for it probably when he was younger. And
No, funnily enough, he didn't.
right?
Yeah. It surprised me at the time, even. He was from Crumlin. He, like, what, before COVID, we had a get together for his 71st birthday with the entire line of clan from Dublin, plus Caroline, Sarah, Kathleen. I took them to Neary's, photographed them in the same pub, same seat that I stood there with Philip in the photograph I'm talking about, all that kind of stuff. And the Dublin line that's protected Philip. Nobody touched Philip.
After Crumlin, it was time to head back into Dublin city centre so it could go on over to the Irish Rock and Roll Museum. The second I stepped foot into the Thin Lizzy exhibit, I was absolutely stunned at the amount of apparel and stuff they had from the band's history. They even had Phil's bass, which he used for every single Thin Lizzy recording and some of his solo stuff. And right beside it, they had the guitar from the King's Call music video. While I was there, I got to talk to one of the tour guides, Brian, and he told me all about the history of the band. Especially how, once the Boys Are Back in Town came out, the band went global. That's when they got their worldwide fan base and toured all around the world. Sadly though, it wasn't as long lived as it should have been, because when Phil's addiction got too much, the band broke up. He went on to make some solo music, but it just never hit the same. And not long after his addiction got bad, he sadly passed away.
When he was coming towards the end, and I didn't think it was the end, I thought he'd dodge it. Philip was brilliant at dodging bullets. He would, love a drink, not too much. He was never a huge drinker, certainly at the beginning. At the end, he was drinking a bottle of brandy a day. That's not in any biography. They always talk about drugs. Nobody mentions alcohol. And I couldn't tell anybody, but I would say to him, I'd give him all health advice. I'd be calling out there to him. We were organising football games on the beach. So here we are walking the beach, and he unloads on me everything that's going on in his life and past from the beginning. Philip was still clinging to the impression of himself as a major rock star and a great family man. Well, on both sides, it was going fucking downhill at high speed because of drugs. He wasn't himself. There's no point in saying that Philip, after that conversation, Philip went downhill and was dead within a year,
Phil passed away in 1986, but his legacy never did. 19 years later, in 2005, a statue of him was unveiled in Dublin city centre. The statue was commissioned by Roisin Dove and unveiled in 2005. It was made by Paul Daly and Leo Higgins and unveiled by his mother Philomena in front of hundreds. It was made in memory of Phil and the legacy that I left for all of Irish music and especially rock and roll.